I should say an historic panel. That always confuses me, that an versus a. I'm talking, of course, about the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. I'm joined by a veritable who's who of the people that have been fighting for 9/11 truth. Barbara, can you introduce yourself to the Crowdsource the Truth audience, and then we'll go through our panel members. First, to introduce and then talk about this historic breakthrough of this grand jury that is being empaneled because of the hard work that you've all done over the past 17 years.
Yes, thank you so much for having us on this show. Yes, people need to know that for over 17 years, the 9/11 Truth and Justice movement has been attempting to move from the forensic facts of 9/11, which we have definitely nailed down, to get into a court, get into a grand jury, so that we can move to the justice part of 9/11 Truth. And this November 7th, as you're going to hear from our attorneys, I'm on the board, but they are the attorneys here on this show. You're going to hear how on November 7th, the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry received an historic letter from the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, which is the legal jurisdiction, the court jurisdiction for the World Trade Centers on 9/11, agreeing to follow the law and submit our grand jury petition demanding a investigation by 23 ordinary patriotic Americans to look at the forensic facts of what actually happened at the World Trade Centers on 9/11. And that is going to happen in the near future. It's historic, and we're very excited about it.
It absolutely is historic. And Barbara, I want to thank you for helping to assemble this panel today. You and I, of course, met only recently, and you're an author. You used to work in the Ronald Reagan administration. You wrote a book that's become sort of the definitive expose on Iran-Contra. I'm talking about October Surprise. Perhaps we'll get a chance to get into that in a moment. But I want to introduce someone who's going to be familiar to our audience, Richard Gage, who, of course, has done tremendous work with the group Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Richard, it was your group that first brought my attention to the presence of nanothermite at the World Trade Center. Can you talk a little bit about, I know it's difficult to sum up the vast array of evidence that you and the other architects and engineers have assembled, but give us a bit of an introduction and explain the big picture view.
Thanks, Jason. We have 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation of the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. And we've been at it for 12 years now, and we've got it packaged to the point where we've now given 600 presentations and 600 radio interviews around the world. So we've reached millions and millions of people, but we haven't yet had the opportunity like we have today to get this evidence in front of a grand jury for an investigation. It's the most exciting thing that's ever happened to us. So here they're going to be seeing the evidence of the third tower that collapsed on 9/11 that most Americans, most architects and engineers don't know anything about. Building 7, a 47-story skyscraper that drops like a rock after witnesses hear explosions straight down uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint on the afternoon of 9/11. We're told that 7 years later by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that this was due to normal office fires. And office fires, of course, have never brought down a skyscraper. So we have an extraordinary opportunity to begin to open their eyes with that evidence, the smoking gun of 9/11. Then we move on to the Twin Towers. And I'll be happy to highlight more of the evidence of the Twin Towers after your other guests are introduced and your audience understands what's really at stake here with this grand jury investigation.
Yeah, and it is historic. I can't thank you all enough. And I mean, Richard, the work that you've done with architects and engineers has been unbelievable. I first became aware of your organization when I watched a documentary just made by another, citizen journalist or whatever we want to call people that are doing what we're doing here, called Anatomy of a Great Deception. And as you pointed out, there are interviews and firsthand testimony with qualified structural engineers, people who are explosives specialists, and there seems to be little doubt in the professional community that this was a controlled demolition, and we'll talk about that a bit more. We have two more members from the Lawyers Committee who are joining us. Gentlemen, why don't we start with Mick? Can you introduce yourselves and tell us what you see happening in the near future with this grand jury?
Sure. So I'm a public interest lawyer, Mick Harrison. I've been representing whistleblowers for about 25 years, mostly in federal agencies and federal courts on a variety of interesting topics. So I am pretty much a government watchdog type. I got involved with the Lawyers Committee a few years ago. And our goal with the Lawyers Committee is transparency and accountability regarding 9/11. So we're trying to bring the full truth out and hold those accountable who are guilty of crimes related to 9/11. And I'll let Dave Meiswinkle introduce himself, and then maybe we can tell you about what we think this grand jury process is all about.
Absolutely. Dave, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thanks for having us on. I'm a retired police officer, and I'm also a criminal defense attorney presently. And a few years ago, a number of us banded together, a number of attorneys, because we were very dissatisfied with the progress of 9/11 being addressed officially by the government. As you know, that it's been 17 years and no real criminal investigation has been done. No grand jury has met. And so, as was mentioned previously by yourself, we believe this is a historical progress here we're making. That at this point in time, the U.S. Attorney has been presented with our petition. It's a 52-page document, and it's supplemented by at least 57 exhibits. And those exhibits will take a while to go through. And certainly Richard Gage can comment on them, and as well as all of us. But we have now taken the initiative, the 9/11 Truth Movement, and it's now the ball's in the court of the U.S. Attorney. And the U.S. Attorney has said that they're going to comply with the law. So if they comply with the law, that means they will make a presentation to a special grand jury. So for the first time, this evidence of controlled demolition of explosions and bombs in the Twin Towers and in that complex will be presented to the public for the first time.
Now, Dave, when did you retire? Were you a New York City police officer?
No, I was in New Brunswick, New Jersey in 2001. Actually, it was ironic. It was about a month before 9/11.
Wow.
That's when I retired, yeah.
Wow. So I would imagine operating out of New Brunswick, New Jersey, you're involved with police associations, et cetera. You probably know several NYPD officers or retired members of the NYPD. Have you communicated with them?
Mostly officers from my own department. A number of them that went up that day, or not that day, but shortly thereafter to help out and just to relay to me the devastation. One of the things, and is most curious, is that both the fire and the police have a protocol, and the first thing you learn in the police academy is to protect your scene, protect the evidence.
Right.
You would have special people come in, or forensics people that would certainly analyze, in particular, the metal, the steel, what happened to it, and look for oddities, look for accelerants, look for explosives, and also look at the concrete that was totally pulverized. So none of that was done. So as a police officer, just retiring as a police officer, that's what alerted me immediately that this doesn't seem to be going according to protocol. A few months later, I went up there and the piles were still smoking. They gave you a mask to walk around the piles. I was amazed, and maybe we'll go into why that was happening. but that was in November. So again, a lot of suspicions just from a point of view before I even got into the literature or even
Right.
knew about architects and engineers' excellent work later on.
But your main point is obviously that whether this was terrorism or something else, this was a crime that somebody perpetrated, and the first thing that should happen is preservation of the evidence to conduct a proper criminal investigation. What we saw was an immediate removal, what I presume you would consider as a law enforcement officer or an attorney, spoliation of evidence.
You're 100% right. And my understanding was that all that metal was cut up into small pieces and shipped overseas. So, I mean, there have to be accountability right from day one or from the very moment that crime is committed. The protocol wasn't followed.
Right. And so as lawyers, maybe you guys can help us understand what normally, when you're looking at spoliation of evidence like this, is there a presumption of guilt, or what are the implications of that kind of mishandling of evidence?
Well, Dave, I can speak to that to start, and you can maybe chime in. The situations vary where you have spoliation questions. In a civil lawsuit, which is what I do in the whistleblower cases, I've actually dealt with spoliation. And if it's proven, you can actually win the case based on that alone.
Wow.
Now, in this case, it's a little different. There were official entities advising the folks who removed the evidence. It wasn't like a rogue person coming in and stealing evidence. It was a group of folks under contract, government contract, doing this. So there really needs to be an investigation into who gave the orders to remove that evidence, who gave the orders to not thoroughly investigate it before it was removed. And that's part of what we're seeking eventually in our grand jury process. And Jason, you may know, some of your listeners may not know, that there's a federal statute that gives every citizen the right to report a crime to a federal grand jury and obligates the U.S. attorney to turn that evidence over to the special grand jury. And that's what initiated this process we're talking about today, is we used that statute.
Wow. And so what can we expect? There's going to be a lot of people here in the audience who are going to be skeptical. We feel like we hear about grand juries getting empaneled all the time, but nothing happens. We've got the Clinton Foundation going on for years and years. H.W. Bush just died. A lot of people would probably say that H.W. may in fact have had something to do, or maybe at least foreknowledge of this. What do we expect from this grand jury? I know you can't, this is like asking Doc, how long am I going to live? But are you hopeful? What do we, Barbara's laughing. What do we think we're going to get from this grand jury, Barbara?
Well, the first thing people need to know, and we need to be realistic, is that grand juries are secret. There's a reason for that. Grand juries, the job of a grand jury in our U.S. System that comes from Britain in the past, was brought over to the United States, is to see, to have ordinary citizens see if there is sufficient information, sufficient evidence to indict one or more parties for a crime. And in a grand jury, the party who would end up being the defendant is not allowed to be there, not allowed to have an attorney. It's all one-sided. It's all prosecutorial side. And so grand juries are secret. But our attorneys here on this this great show that you're giving us the opportunity to have today can speak to perhaps what our backup plans are or might be or could be. But I would like to get right on the table at the beginning that one of the ways that we put pressure on the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York to do the right thing under the law, even though he sent us a letter saying he's going to do it, it is technically secret. We are asking for feedback as to what they're going to do. We have offered to assist in the presentation of the evidence. They don't have to say yes, but we need to put pressure on for that to happen. And the way we're putting pressure on in a completely legal and appropriate way is to go to the American public and the world public for that matter, as widely as possible. There's another historic first that just happened yesterday.
What's
And
that?
that is that for the first time, the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry and Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth have joined forces. And for the month of December, we are doing a blitz public relations campaign, and we have joined forces for a joint fundraising drive for the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry to raise the funds. Our goal is $50,000 through the end of December. So we're going to be telling people how they can contribute to ensure that the Lawyers Committee has the funds to see the grand jury process through to success.
Got it. So for now, Barbara, people can go to Lawyers Committee for FOR 9-11inquiry.org. But actually, you can just go to lcfor911.org.
There's an easier website.
Okay.
It's lcfor911.org, or go to Richard Gage's Architects and Engineers website, which is ae911truth.org. And either place, be sure and click and state that it is for the grand jury project. And your funds will go straight to the grand jury project to ensure its success.
Yeah, this is very important that people support this, because I think we are all deserving of the truth in this matter. And I mean, Richard, you've been one of the most visible and vocal figures in the search for 9/11 answers, the search for 9/11 truth. At a certain point, I mean, 17 years is a long time, and you've been, as I said, I remember seeing you many years ago being one of the first people to talk about this. You've obviously endured derision and people saying that you're a conspiracy theorist and all that. How does it feel to wake up one day and see this kind of tremendous progress?
Oh, it's a great relief, Jason. The opportunity here that we have is unprecedented. We now have to package. It's going to take hundreds of hours on the part of the attorneys and the experts, architects and engineers, to package up the credentials of the experts and our testimony personally in declarations. So it's a very, very important effort we're about. Now, what's going to be in those declarations? Starting with the Twin Towers, where we left off with regarding the evidence, what we're told by the official story is that office fires softened the steel, and the upper part, in the case of the North Tower, above the point of jet plane impacts 15 stories, drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. But none of the photos or videos show any part of a 15-story section driving down. It's gone. It's destroyed. The structure is basically shattered and liquefied in the first 4 seconds. After that, hundreds of first responders hear explosions. Well, this is actually before the driving down. Hundreds of first responders hear explosions. And then after this 4-second period, there's more explosions. And there's laterally ejected, freely flying structural steel sections sent laterally 80 miles an hour out of the sides of the Twin Towers, landing 600 feet in all directions. Gravity works down. So what we're talking about here is the evidence of explosives. And that evidence is seen in squibs, or isolated explosive ejections 20, 40, even 60 stories down below the zone of destruction as it's beginning. And we also have then in all of the World Trade Center dust found by and documented by the U.S. Geological Survey, billions of previously molten iron microspheres. They don't know where these came from. They comprise up to 6% of some of the dust samples, and yet they have no source for it. Well, molten iron is the byproduct of thermite. Thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. So we have the evidence not only in all of these dust samples, but pouring out of the South Tower molten iron minutes before its collapse or destruction. And we have pools of molten iron documented by many structural engineers, and it's on film pouring out of the material held in the crab claw excavators. So this material is documenting the documented evidence of the residue or aftermath of the use of incendiaries. But we also have the use of incendiaries documented by a small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit, Stephen Jones, in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, which is a very clear documentation of these small red-gray chips comprising up to 10 tons in all of this powdered concrete from river to river across lower Manhattan. Small red-gray chips that contain the material of nanothermite at the nanoscales, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. These iron oxide particles and aluminum platelets inside of these red-gray chips. Very high-tech stuff, made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So the attorneys can tell you why they're putting together a document indicating persons of material interest so we can get to the bottom of this.
Yeah. I mean, it's a compelling case that you've put together with, I believe what the lawyers on our panel would consider prima facie evidence that can't be refuted until we find something stronger. And there is no stronger evidence. Richard, this is the first time you and I have had opportunity to speak at any length other than setting up this meeting. And I believe you and I agree that 9/11 represents an incredibly complicated series of events. I think we both share the belief that this is not a matter of airplanes colliding with the building, causing it to collapse, but there have been a lot of people in the social media world and people writing books and things who have put forth a lot of theories. I know you like to stay very, very deeply entrenched in evidence. It's my opinion from looking at evidence that we did in fact have planes collide with the building. Does your research or does any of the legal documentation get into what was going on with those planes? Were they passenger aircraft? Were they military aircraft? Some people would have us believe they were holograms. I personally find that theory to be totally unfounded by any type of evidence or scientific fact. What can you say about what happened prior to the collapse of the buildings?
Well, this research has been done by others and is not in the scope of our work, nor the grand jury petition. So I encourage that discussion in detail for another time, and that we actually look at the solid, irrefutable, as you say, scientific forensic evidence. For instance, the fact that there's 110 stories in each of these towers, and guess what? We don't find, each of them are an acre in size. We don't find 10. We don't even find one of those floors stacked up on the bottom of what we're told is a gravitational progressive collapse.
Right.
No, they've been pulverized. And all the videos show that this pulverization occurs in midair, spreading 90,000 tons of concrete across 3 square miles in a fine powder. No, so if the concrete is not is spread out outside the footprint of the building, and the steel is ejected outside the footprint of the building, well, here's 2/3 of the weight of the building. What is doing the collapse, Jason? There's hardly anything left to cause the collapse of this building if the structural materials weren't even there.
Right. And so have the scientists determined that it was thermite and other explosives in the building that caused all the material to turn to dust, or is there any evidence of anything else causing that?
There seems to be evidence of high energy explosives at work, given the video evidence, and nanothermite also, which is an incendiary, which is engineered to become more explosive. So exactly how that works, we don't know, but we know that it's not, this material, nanothermite, is not made in a cave in Afghanistan.
Of course. So let's get back to some of the legal aspects. Maybe perhaps, David, can you explain to us what exactly will be covered? If not, who was in the planes or what was the nature of the impact? What exactly will this grand jury cover? The collapse?
Right. Well, they can, hopefully they do. But I just wanted to point out that you mentioned the planes, and that's important. And Richard mentioned that maybe that's for another day as far as the planes itself. But the official story, and I think it's to everyone should pay attention to what the official story was or is presently. And that's probably the least possible hypothesis, is that office fires brought the buildings down. Now, there's two sets of buildings. There's the building, the North and South Tower, or WTC-1 and WTC-2, that were hit by airplanes. It's my understanding that the warmest or hottest the fires could be at those points is about 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, caused by the gasoline from the airplanes. The building 7 wasn't hit by an airplane, so it was simple office fires. But a law of nature or law of physics, and Richard can confirm that, is that steel doesn't melt to about 2,800 degrees. So you need another 1,000 degrees of temperature to start to melt the steel and to go along with the hypothesis. The matter of fact is that a steel structured building, and there's been many of them that have caught fire, never, ever has one of them collapsed because of fire. They collapse because they're brought down through a demolition or controlled demolition. And then Richard mentioned, well, we found nanothermite in there, high-grade military explosive. That you would think would be the most common hypothesis to test for explosives. The protocol in this type of building incident to test for explosives. The government decided not to do that.
So one of the biggest doubts that people have about this entire situation is that we're essentially asking the government to investigate itself. Now, Barbara, you've had a lot of experience in these sort of recursive investigations and all of the tail wagging the dog type of stuff that goes on in presidencies like that of Ronald Reagan, which perhaps we would agree may have been more controlled by H.W. Bush than the general public believes. What do you say about any of that?
Well, if I may, I'd just like to make one comment on your previous question, and then I'll try to answer that.
Yes.
And that is that people need to understand that the World Trade Center Towers 1 and 2 were specifically designed by the architects and the engineers to withstand a plane impact of the size, magnitude, and force of impact of what actually happened on 9/11. And in a number of Richard Gage's Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth DVDs and YouTubes, you will see one of them called 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. You will actually see the original engineers state that for the record. So, of course, there were planes that hit World Trade Center 1 and 2, as you're showing on your video screen right there on your computer on the show as I'm speaking. But the point is that it is not possible for the official story of what brought down the World Trade Center Towers 1 and 2, and certainly what the official story that they don't even talk about, actually. There isn't a real official story in the public's mind for World Trade Center 7. They would prefer that we don't even think about it or know about it. But the bottom line is that the official story cannot explain what happened at the World Trade Center Towers. And that's the reason that our grand jury petition and our 57 or so evidentiary exhibits that will be seen soon, if they're not already, by 23 ordinary patriotic Americans in a special criminal grand jury in Manhattan, right close to Ground Zero, where this happened on 9/11, that they are going to see the evidence for themselves that proves this. So I think we should hear from Mick Harrison about why there is a limitation perhaps on the content of our grand jury petition and evidentiary exhibits, that we don't need to talk about the planes because the planes are irrelevant to what happened to collapse the buildings.
Mick?
Sure. Our petition is focused on the crimes related to the destruction of the three World Trade Center buildings. Now, in regard to your earlier question, are we just asking the government to investigate itself, which is an important question. The grand jury, a lot of folks may not know, is independent of all three branches of government. So it's its own governmental entity. It's of constitutional stature. It existed before the Constitution. And the grand jury does not have to take direction from any branch of government. So even though our petition is initially focused on what happened in the collapse and destruction of these three buildings, the grand jury can go from there anywhere it chooses to go. The grand jury has subpoena power. It can, with the U.S. attorney, offer immunity. They can make deals. They can develop evidence in ways the Lawyers Committee cannot. So there's potential there. We are working on a supplement to the petition, and it does address persons with material information. And so we may ourselves do our best to answer questions, one of which you raised, which is, what's the relationship between what happened on the airplanes and what happened in the buildings? Right now, we're focused not on the airplanes, but it's not an irrelevant question, and the grand jury inquiry might eventually answer it.
Got it. I appreciate that. It's important for people to understand. I think normal people watching at home might feel like this is legalese or lawyer speak or whatever it is, but this is such a complex event. It's got to be dissected in this way and handled in a very, I guess, compartmentalized sort of a way, because it's just the nature of the way a complex event and the legal follow-up to something like that is. So I appreciate that answer, and it's good to get this type of insight. So the grand jury is a panel of citizens, basically, who are one of our powerful checks and balances against the branches of the government overreaching, correct?
Correct. And one thing that David Meiswinkle might be ready to tell you is that this grand jury petition may not be our last grand jury petition. There are other aspects of the crimes of 9/11 that we are investigating, and so we do hope to follow up with similar actions in other areas. We don't have conclusions yet in those areas, but we're looking at Shanksville, we are looking at the Pentagon, and so I think you'll be hearing more from us. But one reason that we're hoping to get a good response to our fundraising drive here is to support our immediate work with the grand jury. And Barbara, phrased this as sort of pressuring the government to do the right thing. And in some cases, that's what you have to do. We do have a backup plan, by the way, which we haven't gotten to in case the U.S. attorney doesn't do the right thing. And if you want to know more about that, maybe Dave can start and I can fill in.
David, let us know. What's the backup plan here? Well,
the statute that guides the actions of the U.S. attorney is 18 U.S.C. 3332, and basically that mandates an obligation on his part to present the evidence that we've given him to a special grand jury. Now, if he doesn't do that or decide not to do that, there's an action that's called a mandamus action. We have to file it in the courts, and then we would have a hearing or trial based on the fact that we would be asserting that the U.S. attorney didn't comply with the United States statutes, and therefore we ask the judge to order him to do his duty, to order him to present to a grand jury. And Mick, maybe you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, Jason, if I might just for a minute.
Sure.
We're hoping not to use this backup plan. Our first plan A is to work with the U.S. attorney. We've offered our help. We've asked to be invited to speak directly to the grand jury. We hope that happens. And right now, we are pleasantly surprised that the U.S. attorney has actually agreed to do what the law requires, which is to give our evidence to the special grand jury. So the backup plan is something we assume we will not need, but it's one of those assume the best, prepare for the worst scenarios. So, however, if it turns out that the U.S. attorney does not present our evidence to the special grand jury, then as David says, and we've cited, we developed some case law on this, we do have a right to go into federal district court and ask the judge to direct the U.S. attorney to simply do their job and pass this evidence on to the grand jury. And, I'm cautiously optimistic that the U.S. attorney is going to continue to proceed to do their job in good faith, as we've seen from this first development. And I'm also optimistic that these 23 special grand jurors that Barbara refers to as everyday citizens, which they are, they're going to look at this evidence that Richard Gage and his colleagues have developed for more than a decade now, and they're going to be as impressed with it as we have been.
Right.
May I add something?
Very quickly, Barbara, is it Jeffrey Berman who we're talking about? Is that the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York?
Yes, yes, it
Okay.
is the Jeffrey Berman. And people need to know that the Jeffrey Berman is the U.S. Attorney there in Manhattan, close to Ground Zero, is where the federal courthouse is. And this is the same U.S. Attorney and the same federal court jurisdiction that has just brought serious indictments against some of President Trump's former campaign officials. So they're very serious there. So people need to know it's the same court. I would like to just briefly answer your previous question,
Sure.
which I didn't get to. And that is, I think you asked me, what does my experience in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
with the October surprise, which is the truth behind the deep story of the Iran side of Iran-Contra, have to do with any of this? Well, believe it or not, it really does.
Yeah.
It's because I have personal experience as an individual, concerned public citizen, as we all are here in the 9/11 Truth movement, 9/11 Truth and Justice movement now. I have personal experience as a private citizen, one just myself, developing the information about the truth behind the Iran side of Iran-Contra, all the way to a full subpoena power, under oath testimony, federal congressional investigation by the U.S. House of Representatives. So it is possible for so-called extraordinary, ordinary citizens to make a difference if you just set your mind to it. Miracles can happen. And I actually see the U.S. Attorney's letter as a kind of miracle. I honestly do. You should also know that Mick Harrison and myself, and the first president of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, Jane Clark, who is still with the Lawyers Committee, although she's Dave Meiswinkle on this show is now our new president of the Lawyers Committee. What you should know is that Jane and Mick Harrison and myself were absolutely centrally instrumental in coming up with the vision and the tactics, the strategy and the tactics that resulted in the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, JASTA, to be passed with an original vote in this massively polarized political environment in late 2016, just before the election in 2016, with an original unanimous vote by the House and the Senate of the United States, if you can imagine. And then the only overriding of any of Obama's vetoes in his entire 2 terms as president. So you're looking at a group of people here who really make a difference. And we're calling on everyone who's seeing this program to please support the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiries, push to ensure that the grand jury's work there in the Southern District of New York with our grand jury petition and evidentiary exhibits are successful. And you do that by donating, and you do that by going to the Architects and Engineers website or the Lawyers Committee website. We're in a joint fundraising drive. Go to either place. The donation, special donation button and pledge at the Architects and Engineers site is ae911truth.org, or you can go to the Lawyers Committee website, which is lcfor911.org, and be sure to note that your donation is for the Grand Jury Project. You will make all the difference.
Now, Barbara, when I'm here on the site, the Lawyers Committee site, it's not immediately obvious where that donation link is. Where would people find that?
That is correct. You would
At the
just go to the
bottom.
donation button towards
There
the
it is.
bottom, I believe, and
Yes.
then go to the donation page and make sure in a notation that it's for the grand jury project. Our website is a little bit behind Architects and Engineers. If you go to the Architects and Engineers website and bring that up on the screen, it's a lot more obvious where you donate
Yes.
for the grand jury.
Thanks for bringing that out, Jason and Barbara. There will be a change, so there'll be a button right on the top right, but if you look at the first blog, the article there, as you go down it, there is a link where you hit on it and you'll get a whole page, sort of a landing page for this project.
Yeah.
So what you have to do is start looking at that first article, and midway in that first article, there should be a link to it.
Yep, I'm showing people how to find it. If they go down the right side of the page, there's a donate button that takes you over to PayPal. So back to
Could you
Yes.
bring up the Architects and Engineers webpage for people to see?
absolutely,
It's
absolutely.
a lot more obvious right now there.
Been showing that for sure. So
Right.
people can just go to Architects and Engineers, which is ae911truth.org, and
Right.
right on there they've got a very clear donate button across the top. You can see it right here. People can click on that. It's important that we support these efforts because, you know, it's a recurring theme here on Crowdsource the Truth that, you know, I try to have guests on the show who are doing the work that we would hope the government would do, but it seems to constantly not do it. Now, Barbara, we're back on you, and I've got this photograph here that I'm showing of you standing in the presence of one dope and one evildoer. And I'll let the audience decide who thinks who is
Who's
who.
who?
But yeah, I see George H.W. looking at you in a way right here that causes me to think he might be imagining this young woman is a troublemaker. But
Yes, definitely.
What can you say
by
about
the way,
this
I
photo?
cannot see the whole photograph on my screen. I
Oh,
can
sorry.
only see George H.W. Bush. I don't know. There, a little bit more. I can't see Reagan yet.
I don't want to move the laptop. The audience is seeing it from a different
All right.
feed.
Well,
but
Reagan is, as you're looking at the photograph, it's to my left. That's taken in late December of 1981 in the cabinet room of the White House. And of course, that's then Vice President George Bush Sr. to the right. Reagan is to my left. And there was a reason I was there, but that's irrelevant to go into. Yes, you are absolutely correct. George H.W. Bush saw me as a potential serious problem to him. And my book, October Surprise, certainly put on the record that he had committed high treason. And my book was published while he was president, and here I am. I'm still
Right.
doing work.
now, what do you think about, you know, in his recent death, he was lauded as a national hero, but as you've pointed out, Iran-Contra involved defying the wishes of the Congress and the people of the United States, doing very probably illegal drug importation, resulting in the destruction of thousands of lives, thousands of families, high treason. I mean, it's just pure evil, it would seem.
Right. We're off topic a little bit, but not.
But not
because
exactly,
It's his son, George W. Bush, who was president during 9/11. And of course, that gets into the who did it or the persons with material
Right.
information, which we are developing now, and we can't really talk about until we've actually filed with the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. But as soon as we do, have us back on and we'll tell you about it.
Oh, definitely. And, you know, not to be off topic for too long, but I'm very intrigued by your book, October Surprise, and all of the events of Iran-Contra. So definitely want to have you back on in the future. And I know it does seem like I'm jumping all over the place, but I personally believe that when we talk about events like Iran-Contra, we talk about huge, explosive, pardon the pun, events like 9/11, I think there is a through line that connects a lot of these same perpetrators. Of course, we had Bob Graham's Senate Intelligence Committee producing a 28-page report that was suppressed for something like 16 years. Do any of you want to speak about that? Does that come into play with this grand jury impanelment at all, the 28-page report?
Well, actually, Mick needs to talk about that from the lawyer's point of view. But Mick and I and Jane Clark were central to the strategy and the tactics of the release of the 28 pages, which, by the way, was just the final chapter in the U.S. House and Senate Intelligence Committee's initial joint inquiry report. Came out 2 years before the 9/11 Commission. So Mick will want to address this as well.
Mick, what can you tell us about that?
Well, Barbara and I were instrumental in getting a detailed legal analysis of the secrecy of keeping these 28 pages secret for more than a decade. And what I concluded as a lawyer in doing this analysis was that Congress was deferring to the executive branch to classify a congressional document, the 28 pages, but because of separation of powers, the executive branch has nothing to say about secrecy in terms of congressional documents. Only Congress can make its own documents secret. So we had an illegal secrecy for 13, 14, 15 years, which eventually, thanks to the efforts of the family members and some key Congress people and some folks behind the scenes like Barbara and I, those documents were released. Now, what they show is that the FBI had information that some Saudi-connected officials had provided some aid, some funding, other assistance to at least 2 of the hijackers. Now, not everybody understands that even today. We're not addressing that. We have not addressed that in our initial petition. However, we are looking at persons who may have material information, and eventually the 2 areas of inquiry, what happened to the buildings, what happened on the planes. Eventually, those are going to merge. They haven't merged yet, but they are going to merge. So we do think, pardon my voice, we do think that the grand jury will eventually get to the bottom of this. We hope to do everything we can to help that inquiry get to the goal line. Once you start pulling the thread on something this complex, eventually it all unravels. And, you have to go step by step. And we've started with the evidence, thanks to Richard and his colleagues, that has been best developed. But we don't intend to stop there.
Yeah, and it's always interesting for me to speak with lawyers. I don't mean anything insulting about this. It's like talking to the computer in Star Trek. You got to keep asking questions until you get to the answer that you want. It's my understanding that the 28 pages pretty boldly implicated Bandar bin Sultan and his wife. Bandar bin Sultan, of course, Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, was the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States for many years. He was the director of Saudi intelligence for many years, and he's a close personal friend of George H.W. Bush, former president and avid fisherman, who has even signed this photograph to Bandar, a much younger Bandar here in this photo, where these guys are spending personal time together on a boat. There seems to be an incredibly close relationship between the Bush family and the Saudi royal family, and we've seen so much going on in the Saudi government in the past year or 2 with the multiple incarcerations in the Ritz-Carlton there in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Of course, Al-Walid bin Talal, famous adversary of Donald J. Trump. I know Barbara's no fan of Donald Trump, but it's undeniable that there are warring factions here, and I wonder if we, as the public, aren't seeing certain elements of a Saudi Arabian royal family civil war that may in fact have something to do with 9/11.
It absolutely does. And people need to know that the 28 pages of the original official investigation of 9/11 by the House and Senate Intelligence Committee, the joint inquiry report, those 28 pages are now released thanks to the 9/11 family members and Mick and Jane Clark and myself of the Lawyers Committee and many others. And you can read them online. And you really do need to read them to understand that there are 17 references to Prince Bandar and his links to the alleged hijackers. I underline alleged,
Yeah.
To the alleged hijackers who allegedly controlled the planes on 9/11. But people also need to understand that the Bush connection is absolutely the tightest on the planet, that George H.W. Bush Sr. Was holding a Carlyle Group meeting in Washington, D.C. on the morning of 9/11 with the bin Ladens, and then went to the White House. He was at the White House before his son, the president, George W. Bush, came back. And 2 days after 9/11, Prince Bandar was on the Truman balcony of the White House celebrating with cigars with President George W. Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, and Prince Bandar. They were celebrating. Now, this is the day that the White House facilitated the large numbers of Saudis, both the Saudi royals and the bin Ladens, who were in the United States, to be able to leave the country in special charter flights before American citizens were able to fly any commercial flights again.
Yeah.
It is that tight, the Saudi link to 9/11. So and people also need to know the last thing, and then I'll let others speak. But people also need to know that there is a case that has been in the courts now for years against the Saudi government, which is effectively the Saudi royal family because it's a monarchy, by 6,000 or so 9/11 victims' family members, the Americans who lost their loved ones on 9/11 in the towers, on the plains in Shanksville and Pennsylvania. 6,000 or more 9/11 victims' family members have sued the Saudi government for this connection that's in the 28 pages that you can read online right now, because they've now been released thanks to, in great part, to Mick and myself. We had the strategic vision and followed through to do that. So now that Jamal Khashoggi has been so viciously murdered, and we actually have a bunch of Republicans as well as Democrats wanting to sanction Saudi Arabia, the whole geopolitical environment has changed for people in Congress to take seriously the Saudi connection to 9/11, and that in turn is the Bush connection to 9/11.
Right. Well,
So, Jason, could I add
yes,
something?
please.
So let me do a lawyer thing here and make the first disclaimer that we've made on the program. Barbara is speaking of her own opinions on the Saudi connection, and we are looking at the whodunit part of this. We haven't finished our inquiry on that. And the Lawyers Committee has not made any allegations about any particular person or entity being responsible. We're hoping the grand jury will get to the bottom of that, and we're going to do our best to help the grand jury do it. There is one thing, though, related to what Barbara is talking about that you may want to know, and your listeners may want to know. A special grand jury has a power that is not well understood, seldom talked about, but it can issue a report as part of its investigation on government nonfeasance, malfeasance, or misfeasance, even if no indictment is issued. So if in the process, this special grand jury starts pulling the threads and unraveling what happened here, and they discover improper government secrecy, obstruction of justice by people in the government, go down the list of what may have happened, whether or not it indicts anyone for destroying the buildings, and we suspect with the evidence in front of them they may, but even if they didn't, this grand jury could still issue a report on government misconduct that could be made public by the federal court, and that could look at all kinds of government conduct issues, including possible conflicts of interest and so forth. So we don't know where all this is going to lead, but the grand jury has some tools here to work with.
Mick, can you tell us just briefly, what do some of those terms mean? What's the difference between malfeasance, misfeasance, some of the other feasances you were talking about?
Well, for the grand jury's job, it probably doesn't matter because they have the power to look at all of them. But nonfeasance would be failure to do a duty on the part of a government official. Misfeasance would have to do with doing that duty incorrectly, incompetently, possibly negligently. Malfeasance may be stronger. I'll have to look up my definitions, but it may involve intentional misconduct.
Got it.
So there isn't much that could escape the grand jury's inquiry here if it chooses to look.
And you know, you guys have assembled such an amazing team of people whose skills sort of run the gamut of different areas. Of course, Richard with the architects and engineers, we've got the legal end, and Barbara's experience with government is also very helpful. I've had the rare and excellent opportunity to speak with a wide array of people who I hope would be considered sort of expert witnesses. I'm talking about airline pilots and military intelligence officers, including Scott Bennett and Dan Hanley and Field McConnell. Are these people who would be at all helpful in maybe serving as expert witnesses for the grand jury? Scott Bennett used to work with Dov Zakheim, and although he hasn't been able to discuss this openly on a talk show, I believe he was investigating Dov Zakheim and the SPC, the company that was involved in the flight termination program. Of course, Field McConnell has spoken extensively about the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, and all of these gentlemen have given their professional opinions as airline pilots and intelligence officers as to how some of these things may have transpired. Do you foresee any opportunity for professional witnesses such as the ones I'm discussing to participate?
Well, I would, but the question is when and where. And it depends on what expert knows what issue. Clearly, Richard Gage and his group of experts, we hope, will be testifying directly to this grand jury pursuant to our petition. We can't guarantee that, but we certainly hope it, and we're requesting it. Now, if you're looking at the crimes related to financing the terrorists, that's probably a different grand jury petition, possibly in a different jurisdiction. And that grand jury could then talk to Scott Bennett and folks who have knowledge of the terrorism fundraising issues. There's also the issue of government misconduct and obstruction of justice, which itself could be the focus of a separate grand jury, possibly in another jurisdiction. So, you know, what we've started here is not the end of this process.
Really just sort of opening the door. And Richard, I'm sharing a bit of your documentary that people can get on Amazon Prime. And why don't you let everybody know where they can see this documentary?
Yeah, this is free on YouTube. People can go to just to search on YouTube, Experts Speak Out. And the actual title is 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. We have 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence that has now been included in the grand jury petition in highlight form, only 50 pages, right? This is why the attorneys now have just are beginning the work that has to be done to feed and direct as much as possible the grand jury. And that's why we're raising $50,000. It's not to line our pockets. Believe me, we've got to have these attorneys work in 6 or 7 different categories of major quantities of efforts, hundreds of papers they've got to produce here. And I wanted to make sure that that Mick and Dave have the opportunity to talk about those categories and what it is they have to do in the next several months, which is why we're raising $50,000.
Yeah. Dave, was there anything you wanted to pick up on that topic?
Oh, sure. There's what we call Freedom of Information Act, or a FOIA, and that's an investigation or where you would request various documents from the government, and you would do so because you want to follow up certain leads, and that lead could lead to other leads, and we may have to go into court to litigate those. As Mick said too, as we want to gather experts if we could and take their declarations. We have lay witnesses that have testimony to give, so we would want to interview them and also take their statements. We would like to interact with the U.S. attorney. We've told them we would be willing to assist them we would be willing to present some of the evidence with them. And so we hope to get a relationship where we can talk with them on a friendly basis. We don't know what to expect. There's things that we've not been down this road before, so we want to be prepared to be able to react to what is necessary to react to, and that's
Right.
one of the reasons why you have to have some funds available for that. Mick mentioned before, and what we were considering, we don't have to right now. It's on the back burner because the U.S. Attorney is complying with our request, but a mandamus action, which would obligate us to go into court and to submit briefs and argue, etc. So that's some of the things that we're looking at that we want to do. And as Mick mentioned too, it doesn't really have to do with this in itself, this fundraising, but this is a multi-tiered crime over many scenes. I mean, we talk about the Pentagon, we talk about Shanksville, we talk about just the government totally. Overall, basically the obstruction involved that day, it seemed whatever could go wrong did go wrong, or whatever should have been done wasn't done. And we started the show off today with just the simple evidence at ground zero, how that wasn't saved and it wasn't, the protocol wasn't followed. So because of all the things that I mentioned, and there's others I'm sure that Mick can mention, that's why we want to gather the funds now to have them ready to use however we can deploy them. It's sort of like, it's not a good analogy, but if you have a gun and we have no bullets, that's not good. So we have a good case, but we want to go forward with it, and the best way to go forward is be able to finance it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that there's nobody getting rich from spending 17 years swimming against the stream. I mean, I'm sure each of you can share stories of how relationships, professional and personal, have been broken over speaking out about 9/11. Barbara, you seem ready to discuss that.
Yeah. Well, everything that we do is a labor of love for our country and a dedication to truth and justice. We are not in this for personal gain. Believe me, it's just the opposite. We have taken what is the slogan? The outrageous slings and arrows of outrageous fortune.
Yeah.
We have been called everything in the book. By the way, I'm proud to be a conspiracy realist. And people need to know that at least what I've read is that in the Department of Justice, the most commonly brought indictment for a crime
Conspiracy, yeah.
is for conspiracy, which is conspiracy is a real thing. So the Department of Justice is a conspiracy theorist going into court more often than they are anything else. So I'm a proud conspiracy realist.
You know, Barbara, you and I met, of course, at Judith Baker's JFK conference in Dallas in November, and conspiracy theorist has become a derogatory term that the uninformed like to hurl at people who ask questions about sophisticated, unsolved, and even uninvestigated crimes like the murder of JFK, the destruction of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 9/11. So it's interesting to me how I think if you were to poll 100 people on the street today, what does the word conspiracy mean? It's almost become synonymous in common vernacular with falsehood. You say, oh, that's just a conspiracy. Most people think that means you're talking about something that isn't true. Of course, your book, October Surprise, that people can purchase on Amazon.com, talks about one of the most sinister and destructive conspiracies in the history of our country, and that was the planning and execution of the event known as Iran-Contra. It certainly wasn't just Barry Seal and Oliver North putting that whole thing together.
No, it wasn't. People need to know that we now have proof of this. There was a CIA memo in the wake of, as I recall, in the wake of the JFK movie. But in any case, it's surrounding the JFK assassination. and ordinary, extraordinary citizen investigators and researchers and publicists and authors getting out the truth about what happened in the JFK assassination, that it was a government sanctioned event.
Yeah.
When that happened, the CIA got so worried that too many of the American people and people in the world would believe the truth and know what the evidence was, that they came up with a memo in which they put out that we should call these people conspiracy theorists, and we should move to where that word simply means that they're basically nuts. But I'll just go on the record here that I think the majority of the American public, that the 9/11 truth movement has been so successful that at least half of the American public now understands that the official story is false. And I think that's part of the reason that the U.S. attorney has agreed to move forward with the grand jury.
I think you're correct, and I think the efforts being undertaken by the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry and, of course, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth are absolutely incredible. And I mean, each of you have played historic roles. Richard, I believe I've seen videos in which you've been derided by critics. Do you want to share anything with us about your journey from starting this to today, where you're standing on the precipice of finally, hopefully, seeing some justice done?
Yeah, we've certainly taken our share of hits. There's a number of debunkers out there, for instance, that take pot shots at us and our evidence. But they don't address, the deepest meaning of the evidence, where it comes from. It's scientific, forensic based. For instance, we rely a lot on official sources for our evidence. And FEMA, for instance, in their initial report in 2002, produced the Building Performance Assessment Report. And in Appendix C, they include a metallurgical examination of the steel from both World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7, Building 7 and the Twin Towers. And they document a hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel with liquid molten iron and sulfur. Well, these are on a very, they only managed to save like 0.02% of the steel from these buildings. The rest was shipped to China for recycling before investigators could get their hands on it and do a proper investigation. Wow. So here's this metallurgical examination that requires us to see that thermite was used. That thermite's what releases molten iron, and sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So we have, by FEMA themselves, this detailed metallurgical examination, which when NIST took over the investigation, they threw it out. So this is clearly malfeasance on NIST. Only the beginning of the malfeasance we're going to be documenting.
And you know what? I can't help myself but to ask you a question that I know you're not going to want to answer, but do you believe that an aircraft traveling, let's say, 500 plus miles per hour would generate sufficient kinetic energy to enter the building in the way that we saw it, as it were, a knife cutting through butter?
Let's put this to rest. Yes, there were planes. Yes, they did hit the towers. Yes, no, they didn't slice through steel like a hot knife through butter. What they did is punch out the 3 vertical columns on the exterior perimeters held together by 3 horizontal spandrel panels, and they punched those out, such that the outline of the airplane's impact upon the building was a series of orthogonal or 90-degree cuts, where not cuts, but pushing out
penetrations.
Penetrations. That's the word. So it's very clear that happened, and we're coming out with a letter which we're going to be publishing on Journal of 9/11studies.com. Which talks about not just the physical evidence of the plane's impact, but also the multitude of videos, 40 of them, showing the plane hitting the towers.
Right.
And is hearing and seeing the planes hitting the towers, in some cases both. So the evidence is voluminous. Now, which planes?
Yes.
There seems to be some serious questions about whether those were civilian aircraft or not.
Or perhaps KC-46s or something like that. You know, I've seen some of these quote-unquote debunk videos that try to have us believe that computer graphics or visual effects were used to create these videos where the planes hit. I'm sure you're in touch with a lot of experts in those fields, but I've done my own expert analysis, having had a long career in stereoscopic filmmaking and visual effects, and the people who think they're debunking the fact that planes hit the buildings are incorrect. So if there's anything that I can contribute from that standpoint in terms of debunking the notion of visual effects, I'd be happy to do that. David, is there anything that you wanted to say to us in closing? We're just about out of time here.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, this since 9/11, I guess we can call there has been a war on terrorism. But if we can all think back then, if it was properly investigated at that time, perhaps there would have been no necessary war on terrorism. We've seen a war in Iraq where we killed approximately 1 million people for weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. And that was preceded by the anthrax attacks, which were very suspicious. We didn't talk about them today. Then you have the incursions into Afghanistan. You have the indefinite detention, which is a direct attack on our Constitution. You have the drones attacks where people can be killed without any kind of being charged with a crime. You had the Patriot Bill. You have the Homeland Security. You have NSA, where right now all of our telephone bills, our whatever emails, our text messages can be seized and stored forever ad infinitum. You have the problems with TSA at the airports. You have Guantanamo. You have the people down there without any due process, and you have torture. These things were unheard of prior to 9/11. So we can roll it back with a grand jury investigation. Maybe we can recover those aspects of our Constitution, which unfortunately we have lost, and which some of us don't realize.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I recently did an interview with Bill Binney, who was formerly with the NSA, and he spoke in great detail about all of the things that you're mentioning, the unbelievable intrusion into our privacy, which, you know, all of these things are interconnected. We're now seeing how some of these tools that were enabled after September 11th have been used to spy on President Donald Trump and members of his cabinet, including and just associates of his, including Dr. Jerome Corsi, and frankly, I'm sure each of us here on that panel. So I definitely want to thank each of you for coming forward today. Mick, was there anything that you wanted to leave us with before we wrap it up?
Well, thank you, Jason. First, thanks for having us. I appreciate the opportunity. I do think we're at a moment in history here, and that may be the big message from this development. We have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to have the justice system work like it should work and use the independent grand jury to develop this evidence and bring some transparency and accountability to this issue, which is long overdue. So we do ask for the public support. This is not a lawyers committee thing. It's not a Richard Gage thing, a Dave Meiswinkle thing, a Barbara Honegger thing, a Mick Harrison thing. This is an American public thing.
Yeah.
We have to do this as a informed, concerned citizenry if we're going to have accountability here. So we invite the American public to join us in this effort. And thank you again for having us.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you guys are doing. You know, this is supposed to be a government for the people, by the people, and of the people, but it seems sometimes like it's not quite that. So I really have a lot of respect for brave individuals like each of you who come forward and really make the effort to hold our government accountable. You know, I apologize that I haven't figured out how to put all four of us on screen at once, so I'll just drag this little control bar over here so everybody can see each of you before we go. This has been a really informative session, and I absolutely just can't thank each of you enough for joining me. I want to remind all of our viewers, we've got over 1,000 people watching right now on this live stream across the many platforms that we use. I hope that everyone will go to the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 webpage, which you can just find at lcfor911.org. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can donate to this effort. It's very important that the lawyers that are working to inform this grand jury that they've worked so hard to get impaneled, it's very important that they have the financial resources to keep going. People can also go to the Architects and Engineers website. It's ae911truth.org. You can donate there. And you know, one of the most important things that you can do is you can share these websites, you can share these broadcasts with your friends, with your family. The first step is to wake people up and to let them know that this is not crazy people wearing tinfoil hats. These are experienced lawyers, experienced engineers, experienced architects, people who have experienced firsthand experience in government with the very people that we're talking about investigating. And the people that are closer to the crazy end of the spectrum are those that are listening to this official story that evidence and fact and just scientific evaluation does not support. It's a fairy tale that we've been told about 9/11. I want to thank each of my brave guests for joining me today. I definitely hope that each of you will join me in the future, and this is something we're going to keep a very close eye on here on Crowdsource the Truth, this historic grand jury that is being impaneled here in the Southern District of New York to investigate these aspects of the horrendous crimes of 9/11. And I want to remind everybody that Crowdsource the Truth is a viewer-supported resource, so I hope you'll sponsor this program by going to patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth or making a one-time sponsorship payment at paypal.me/crowdsourcethetruth. Thank you very much to
May
lawyers.
I
Yes,
add, it's important
absolutely.
for your viewers and listeners, when you do donate to our joint fundraising project, the Lawyers Committee and Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, whichever website you go to, be sure and note that your donation is for the grand jury project.
Absolutely. And Barbara, thank you so much for taking a role here today. Richard, thank you for helping put this panel together. And I also want to thank Captain Dan Hanley, who people have seen on the show, for introducing me to Richard. I think we've emailed a bit in the past, but you're very busy, I understand, and I appreciate you taking the time today. Thanks to each and every one of you, and thank you to everyone for watching. I will see you tonight at 8 p.m. only on Patreon for more pain, so tune in for that. And thanks to all my guests today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.